When most of us think about addiction recovery, um, a pretty standard picture comes to mind, right?
Yeah, detox, maybe that 28-day rehab program, hitting some meetings, working the steps.
Feels like a pretty complete path.
But what if that common understanding is, well, as the paper we're diving into argues, actually dangerously incomplete?
Okay, let's unpack this. We're taking a deep dive into a paper called From Sobriety to Society. And it really takes a hard look at the current addiction recovery system, especially here in the U.S.
And one of the most striking points it makes right away is this. Recovery doesn't end when someone achieves sobriety.
Doesn't end there.
No. The paper makes a really strong case that sobriety is actually just the beginning.
Huh. The beginning.
Yeah, the real ongoing battle happens after someone stops using, and it's fought against powerful external forces, things like, poverty, the weight of overwhelming stigma, broken systems.
And that lack of purpose.
And that profound sense of lacking purpose or belonging.
Exactly. Yeah, the paper does not pull its punches at all. It describes the current system as outdated, underfunded, and fundamentally broken.
And it argues the focus is way too narrow, right? Fixated on short-term abstinence.
Rather than the long-term wellness and reintegration people desperately need, it feels reactive and, punitive.
Instead of supportive and proactive. Yeah.
So our mission for this deep dive is to really get into those systemic failures the paper highlights.
We're going to look at the pieces it says are missing from the picture, and then, strictly based on what this source tells us, explore what a truly comprehensive system might actually look like.
All right, let's jump right into the first major area, the paper critiques about the current setup.
Okay. It really zeroes in on what it calls the inadequacy of the existing recovery infrastructure.
And a big piece of that inadequacy, according to this analysis, is what's labeled the one-size-fits-all model.
Right. It lays out the standard U.S. approach, detox, that very common 28-day inpatient stay, maybe some outpatient after.
Which sounds familiar.
Totally. But the paper's critique here is pretty sharp. It emphasizes that addiction is incredibly individualized.
How so?
Well, it stems from diverse roots, trauma, mental illness, genetics, environment, all sorts of things.
So that standard program might not fit everyone.
Exactly. For so many people, particularly those dealing with mental health conditions alongside addiction, that 28-day program is described as woefully insufficient.
Woefully insufficient.
Yeah, it's just not designed to go deep enough or last long enough for those complex intertwined issues.
When that standardized, often insufficient model doesn't work, leading to relapse, the paper points out another huge problem.
How relapse is treated as failure. Yeah.
It cites a statistic from NIAID, the National Institute on Drug Abuse, reporting that between 40 and 60% of people relapse after treatment.
Which is a high number. But what's fascinating here is how the paper frames this.
How does it frame it?
Instead of viewing relapse as like a predictable part of a chronic disease, which is how the paper advocates we see eviction.
Like diabetes or something where symptoms might flare up.
Precisely. Instead of that, the system often interprets it as a personal failure.
Oh, that framing must have terrible consequences for someone already struggling.
Absolutely. The paper argues that this punitive approach, treating relapse like a moral failing instead of a medical symptom, actively discourages people from reaching out for help again.
You'd feel like you blew it.
Right. It fuels deep cycles of shame and guilt, which tragically often drives people right back to continued substance use because they feel they've already failed the system and themselves.
And on top of that, simply getting into that initial, often inadequate system is a massive hurdle for so many.
Yeah.
The paper highlights significant access and affordability barriers.
It quotes a really striking statistic from a 2023 SAMH report. That's the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration.
What did it find?
Only 1 in 10 individuals with a substance use disorder actually receive any form of treatment that year.
1 in 10. That's staggering.
It really is. And it leads you to ask, why? Why is access so incredibly limited?
So what barriers does the paper point to?
It lists several specific ones it identified: lack of insurance or just prohibitive costs, huge geographical disparities, particularly in rural areas.
Makes sense. Fewer options out there.
Yeah, and frustratingly long waiting lists for treatment beds, plus persistent racial and socioeconomic inequities in who actually gets care.
So the paper calls this whole situation a broken pipeline.
Exactly. People are essentially forced to wait until they hit rock bottom.
Which is such a common phrase associated with addiction.
It is, but the source is incredibly clear on this point. Hitting rock bottom should never be the entry requirement for receiving care.
That seems backward.
The system currently pushes people into absolute crisis before offering help, which the paper calls fundamentally flawed.
Okay, so those are the major issues the paper points out within the traditional treatment structure itself. But it argues the problems are much, much bigger.
Exactly. They stretch far beyond the walls of treatment centers. It shifts to what it terms systemic issues beyond treatment doors.
And the first major one is the deep, troubling connection between addiction and the legal system, or the criminalization of addiction.
This feels deeply rooted in history, doesn't it? The paper connects this back decades,
How far back?
stating that for too long, addiction has been seen as a moral failing deserving of punishment, rather than a health condition requiring care.
Right, not a medical issue, but a moral one.
And it explicitly ties this view to the legacy of the war on drugs,
Ah, okay.
which the paper notes disproportionately impacted communities of color and low-income neighborhoods, prioritizing mass incarceration over rehabilitation.
Is there data on that link between incarceration and substance use?
Yeah, there's a pretty shocking statistic cited. Over 65% of the U.S. prison population meets the criteria for substance use disorder.
65%, that's just wild.
It is, yet the paper points out only a tiny fraction of those individuals receive any kind of treatment while they're incarcerated.
So, no treatment inside.
Which sets up the revolving door the paper describes.
Makes sense. You go in, don't get help, come out.
Precisely. The paper argues that putting someone in jail doesn't treat addiction. Often, it makes it worse.
And then they face challenges on the outside.
Immediately, they face a wall of barriers that make staying in recovery incredibly difficult.
What kind of barriers are we talking about specifically?
The paper lists difficulty finding employment, unstable housing situations, that persistent social stigma we were just talking about,
That's stigma.
and very limited access to treatment or support once they're out.
So they get out, face these massive hurdles, and without support, relapse becomes much more likely.
Potentially leading them right back into incarceration.
Yep.
It creates a vicious, destructive cycle, as the paper puts it.
Wow.
And its conclusion on this is powerful. Reforming drug policy isn't just a legal or political debate. It is, at its core, a recovery issue.
Speaking of stigma, the paper dedicates a whole section to the role of stigma and how it actively works against recovery.
It uses a striking phrase, language as a weapon.
Language as a weapon. Tell me more about that.
This is such a critical point the paper makes. It highlights how harmful terms like junkie, crackhead, and just simply addict are still so common.
Even in professional settings.
Even sometimes in healthcare settings where people might be labeled non-compliant or drug-seeking, the paper argues these labels strip away a person's humanity.
Reducing them to just their addiction.
Exactly, reducing them only to their lowest moments and making recovery seem impossible.
And that kind of language isn't just hurtful. The paper shows it has real, tangible consequences, right?
Absolutely. It mentions research showing that healthcare providers who hold the view that addiction is a moral failing of you often reflected in their language or attitudes.
They're less likely to help.
Significantly less likely to refer patients for the treatment they need. The paper stresses that this kind of stigma isn't just an external problem.
It gets inside people.
It infiltrates families, workplaces, and even some recovery communities, making genuine healing harder.
And when that external stigma is constantly hitting you, I imagine it can become internalized.
That's what the paper calls internalized shame. When people absorb society's negative judgments, it can become deeply ingrained in their identity.
That sounds devastating.
And the paper identifies the shame as one of the most powerful relapse triggers.
So even good programs struggle if there isn't compassion.
Without fostering a culture of compassion, empathy, and true understanding, the paper concludes even the best clinical programs will struggle to succeed long-term.
So if the traditional treatment system is often insufficient, and massive systemic issues like criminalization and stigma are actively pushing people down, what else does this paper say is needed?
Right, it really shifts gears here to talk about the crucial role of social determinants.
Social determinants, like the environment around the person.
Exactly. The paper makes a compelling case that recovery isn't just about clinical treatment. It requires fundamental societal support structures.
So it's not just about fixing the person in isolation.
Less about fixing the person in isolation and more about creating an environment where recovery can actually take root and thrive.
And a major piece of that environment, it points out, is economic stability. It identifies employment and financial stability as huge relapse triggers.
Yeah, being unemployed or financially insecure. It backs this up with a compelling statistic from a 2022 study.
What did that study find?
Individuals in recovery who secured steady employment were 5 times more likely to maintain long-term sobriety.
5 times more likely. That's significant.
Huge. Yet, as the paper notes, many face significant discrimination when looking for work due to past criminal records or gaps in their work history.
It's a catch-22, isn't it? Need a job for stability, but can't get one because of the past.
Exactly. And housing, too. You really can't focus on healing if you're constantly worried about having a roof over your head.
No, absolutely not.
The paper echoes that sentiment precisely, stating quite powerfully, you cannot heal if you are sleeping on the street or couch surfing.
It calls stable, sober housing foundational to recovery.
Foundational. But like jobs, access to safe, stable housing is a huge barrier.
What are the problems there?
Well, the paper points out the ongoing scarcity of affordable housing generally.
True everywhere, it seems.
And it also raises concerns about the lack of regulation and oversight in some recovery residences.
Oh, like sober living homes.
Yeah, which unfortunately can sometimes create chaotic or even exploitative living situations instead of supportive ones.
So not always the safe haven they should be.
Right. And beyond those basic needs like housing and jobs, the paper also strongly emphasizes the need for community and purpose.
Community and purpose.
That's right. Recovery, the paper argues, is deeply reliant on connection.
Like peer support groups.
While peer support programs like AA and NA are absolutely vital and mentioned as important resources, the paper suggests they aren't enough by themselves.
Okay, what else then?
People need to feel like they matter, like they have a place where they belong in a broader sense of society.
What kind of community and purpose is the paper suggesting makes a difference? Does it give examples?
It does. It highlights access to things like educational opportunities, creative outlets, volunteer work.
Things that give life meaning beyond just not using.
Exactly. And faith-based communities as factors that can significantly improve long-term recovery outcomes. It's about helping people rebuild a life that has meaning and connection.
Not just focusing on abstaining from substances.
Right.
Okay, so we've really unpacked the problems. The paper identifies the inadequate treatment system itself, the bigger systemic issues like criminalization and stigma, and the critical role of social support. Here's where it gets really interesting. What does the paper actually propose we do? What does this system overhaul look like, according to this source?
Okay, yeah, this is the constructive part. It offers specific policy recommendations and systemic shifts. First up, integrating recovery care much more deeply into mainstream healthcare.
What does it call that?
Integrating recovery into healthcare.
How would that change things day to day? What would that look like?
Well, the paper recommends things like universal screening for substance use disorders becoming routine in primary care settings.
Like just another part of a regular checkup.
Exactly, like checking blood pressure. It strongly advocates for medication-assisted treatment, or MAT, to be a standard of care.
Instead of a last resort.
Right, not something treated as a last resort or viewed with suspicion. And it stresses the urgent need to fully enforce existing mental health parity laws.
Ah, parity. So that addiction treatment is covered by insurance just like any other medical condition.
Precisely. No more fighting for coverage.
The paper also tackles the criminalization issue head-on, with recommendations around decriminalization and diversion.
Yes, it suggests shifting low-level drug offenses away from traditional arrests and incarceration.
Towards what?
Towards treatment-based alternatives. It proposes expanding drug courts to include more comprehensive wraparound services.
What are wraparound services?
Things like housing support, job training, mental health care, addressing the whole picture. And making sure people have access to MAT and therapy, both while they are in jail and, crucially, after they are released.
The idea is to route people to care, not cages.
That sums it up well. It really does feel like a fundamentally different philosophy than the current dominant approach.
It absolutely is. And the paper champions the adoption of something called recovery-oriented systems of care, or ROSC.
ROSC, what's the core idea there?
This model is built on the understanding that addiction is a long-term chronic condition.
Okay, like we talked about earlier.
Similar to managing diabetes or heart disease. It requires ongoing support, not just a short intervention.
And what are the key features of this ROSC model, as the paper describes it? What does it involve?
It puts a big emphasis on things like peer recovery coaches, people with lived experience who can provide invaluable support and guidance.
That makes a lot of sense.
It also includes long-term case management, to help people navigate challenges over time, family education programs, because addiction impacts the whole family system.
Right, the family needs support too.
And crucial workforce development and job training programs to help address those employment barriers we discussed.
Connecting all the dots.
Exactly. And finally, the paper argues for much heavier investment at the very beginning of the process, focusing on prevention and early intervention.
Trying to stop problems before they escalate. What does that involve?
The recommendations here include implementing robust school-based mental health programs, ensuring trauma-informed care starts in childhood.
Addressing root causes.
Right, to address some of the root causes the paper mentions, and supporting community coalitions focused on reducing substance exposure and promoting healthy environments from the ground up.
So these are the theoretical solutions outlined in the paper. Does it offer any real-world examples or evidence where some of these different approaches are being tried?
It does. It looks at specific case studies that serve as evidence for some of these principles in action.
Okay, like where?
One prominent example discussed is Portugal.
Ah, Portugal. Heard about that. What did they do differently, according to the paper?
Well, in 2001, Portugal decriminalized all drugs for personal use.
Decriminalized everything.
For personal use, yes. But the paper emphasizes that they didn't just stop arresting people. They simultaneously invested massively in treatment and social reintegration services.
Ah, that's the key. So they connected people to healthcare, housing, job support.
Exactly. It wasn't just about not punishing.
And what results did the paper highlight from that approach? Were there positive outcomes?
The paper cites dramatic positive outcomes. A 75% reduction in drug-related deaths.
Wow, 75%.
Significant decreases in HIV infection rates among drug users, and overall increased access to care and social inclusion for people who use drugs.
So it reframed the issue from crime to public health.
That seems to be the core shift. Another example mentioned is closer to home, in Vancouver.
Vancouver, okay. What's the example there?
Yes, the paper points to Vancouver's Insight program, which is a supervised injection site.
Right, a place where people can use pre-obtained drugs under medical supervision in a safe environment.
And what impact does the paper attribute to that specific harm reduction model? Does it work?
The source highlights that Insight has saved thousands of lives by providing a safe space, preventing overdoses, and the spread of diseases.
So direct life-saving impact.
Definitely. And it has also been incredibly effective at connecting users with essential health services, things like addiction treatment, medical care, and counseling.
Because they're already there, engaging with the system.
Exactly, without the fear of judgment or arrest that often keeps people away from help.
Wow. This deep dive into From Sobriety to Society really makes you reconsider everything you thought you knew about addiction recovery.
It absolutely flips the script, doesn't it? The core message the paper leaves us with is powerful. Sobriety isn't the finish line.
It's the starting point.
It's the crucial starting point. If we genuinely want people to recover and build fulfilling lives long term, the system must look beyond abstinence and recognize the whole person. Meaning providing comprehensive medical and mental health support, yes, but it's equally vital to address stable housing, meaningful employment, and genuine community connection.
It's a call for a much broader societal response then, not just a treatment issue.
That's what it feels like. The paper essentially calls for us to stop reacting to pain with punishment and instead focus on healing the underlying causes and conditions.
So it's not just an argument for better treatment programs in isolation.
No, it's a profound call for a more compassionate, integrated society where recovery is truly supported and celebrated, not just tolerated.
Given how interconnected this source argues addiction recovery is with fundamental societal structures like housing, employment, and community belonging, it leaves us with a challenging thought.
What's that?
What responsibilities do societies have beyond just the healthcare system in truly supporting long-term healing for people struggling with addiction?